I want to talk about this tweet because this tweet has been kind of going around a lot. This tweet is not. It's good and bad because this is true, right? A lot of people give shitty advice, right? Like terrible advice. But also like this sort of example isn't really quite fair. Fighting games are pretty, they require a little more substance, right? Like it's not so linear as like you just do this and you win. You do that, that's it. They are correct. A lot of people are really, really bad at giving advice, like terribly giving advice. And I do have a bit of a theory for this. That's the kind of problem with fighting games. It's not so linear. I feel like a lot of people tend to view like this sort of thing as well as like just general fighting game practices. As a person, you know, you're gonna have a good days and bad days in all ways, right? Like not just with fighting games or competing, but like, you know, some days you wake up, you slept like shit, you feel like trash. Some days you wake up, you slept great, you know, you're ready to do like triple backflips. You know, when I was younger, I was really bad at doing backflips, but I'm pretty good at doing backflips right now. I just felt like sharing. This kind of example, take your turn back but don't hit buttons, take the throw but don't get thrown, keep moving but slow down, learn frame data but don't respect advantage. This example is kind of whack, but I don't want people to be like mean to this person because they're not wrong at the same time. It's just not entirely true. If you've ever seen this video, this is a classic Core A video. It's basically about the 3 types of fighting game players. You've probably heard about it. This sort of video is actually really great for discussing what like this sort of field, right? So we're gonna talk about this as we go along with it, okay?
OG veteran and Evo champ Ryan On, aka Laugh, was kind enough to let me, and by extension you, in on one of his theories. He feels that there are 3 archetypes of fighting game players, and most players exhibit varying degrees of each one, kind of like a radar chart. The 3 attributes we're talking about are the brains, the heart, and the body. So
this, I feel like, is actually very true, right? Like this whole concept is very true. Just to like preface this, through my experience playing fighting games, the only one like I can 100%, there is the brains and there's the heart. The body, I'm not 100% sold on, but the first 2 absolutely, and this is gonna be very important for what we get into.
All this is pretty abstract, so I'll elaborate. The brains refers to the scientific player.
That's
this
me.
Is the lab monster who is constantly in training mode,
That's
finding
me.
the best options and answers to particular situations.
But see, this also isn't entirely true because I would be considered a brains player in the past, but I never used training mode like back in like early Xer.
The brains-based player is the most thrilled to find an option select that can cover 3 possibilities in one setup, and aims to have a concrete answer for every moment of the match. However, because there are virtually infinite scenarios in a fighting game, it's not
Friend of the stream, Shine, look.
And this is where being solely a brains-based player has its limits. Unfamiliar situations can be downright scary, and the fact that you're playing a fighting game and not chess means that you don't have time to analyze how best to handle it. In contrast, the heart refers to the emotional or feel-based player.
So for example, you know who's 2 great examples of this? I would be more classified under as the brain, right? Like I always talk about risk reward, specific interactions that usually will lead to the most benefit for me. Whereas heart would be more someone like Hotashi, right? Hotashi is like a great example of like a heart-based player, right? He always talks about, he loves to do reads. I remember I talked to him about a matchup and I wrote like 2 paragraphs about how like, you know, if this interaction happens, I think about RPS, depends on the meter situation, I try to get meter advantage, like all these things, and he's like, I just kind of do what feels right. It was kind of like that Chad meme, honestly.
A field-based player thrives in the scientific player's fear.
Oh, another sign this video is a little old, huh?
To the metagame to get the edge they need in order to win. For those unfamiliar, the metagame is a game played outside of the main game that still affects the main game. This brings us to the final archetype to round out the theory. This type of player is known as the body, which refers to players known for their physical capabilities, which in fighting games refers to execution and reactions. The balance between mind, body, and heart has been expressed countless times in fiction before, and one that's unequivocal about it is the Wizard of Oz. The cowardly lion has a brain, but is fearful. The clumsy scarecrow is brainless, but has a heart. And the Tin Man represents a physical body without any human organs.
This example is a little ham, but
how is any of this useful? Well, it's not terribly useful on the surface, but with some thinking and playing Theory Fighter, it can change the way you approach a match.
they're essentially saying like every player has variety of this. Like even though I'm a brain-based player, I have like some attributes of others, right? Like specifically, I always talk about my autopilot tends to be I devise a plan or a strategy preemptively, right? And then I autopilot through it, right? So it's not that I'm just like only just brains. I just associate more with that because typically that's where my game plan is, and typically it's more about me. When I play my best, I turn off the body aspect. You know what I mean? If people are typically like a full-on body player, like some people are just body heart players. This is typically like a very good example of a player that may not have always the best understanding of what's happening or like how to win or how to adjust for a different character. Typically they're the ones that may struggle with giving the like advice the most because, you know, a lot of the time their interactions and stuff that happens is based on feeling. The feeling is typically built around experience, around playing against players who, through that sort of like repetition and obviousness of how strong an option is, it becomes predictable, right? And that's where essentially a lot of body players tend to thrive, right? Body-based players tend to be a little more linear with their thought process because a lot of it is kind of like internalized feeling and not necessarily thoroughly thought out like situations, right? I do find that this sort of situation is, or this sort of thought process around brains, body, heart is like it. I mean, brains doesn't always mean that they're going to be successful either. This is the sort of thought process I have, right? Because if you are a very feels-based player, it's usually like you flip a switch, right? That's usually how it tends to go. Some people tend to be very successful if you, like, let's say, if you just keep getting thrown, I mean, they're still gonna know to throw you all the time, right? If you keep moving all the time and you move without a purpose, then you're gonna be vulnerable to just dying, right? Which, again, that's kind of the problem, right? There's a lot of nuance to just discuss, not just in this, but in also how you teach, right? So that's why I think it's not entirely wrong, but it's not quite right either. You know what I mean? If you just take your turn back, you know, and you always hit buttons, then you're going to be predictable. If you're predictable, you're going to die. It doesn't matter who you are. If you take the throw, the risk reward is better, right? But the problem is if you only take the throw, then you're just only going to get thrown, right? Simple as that. Learn frame data, right? Obviously, super important, but don't respect advantage. Again, because essentially it becomes a point where if you end up respecting advantage all the time, you become predictable. A lot of people tend to struggle with this because it's not as linear, right? It's not just black and white. It's not just you are losing to someone that's a body player. Typically, they may have the inclination of telling you like, okay, well, this is how you beat what I'm doing right now. But if you do that, they're just gonna swap over to the next layer, right? This is kind of the problem with advice on both sides, right? And it's not just like, some people are truly bad at getting advice, asking for advice, right? Like these sort of things, like how do I stop losing? Well, I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about, right? It's a hard question to answer. It's usually better to talk about, like, you know, if I keep losing in neutral, do you think I could press any better buttons or something like that? Be more specific and it comes out a lot easier. And these are not like necessarily, one is not better than the other, right? Like a body player can body a brains player. Like I think a good example of like Sonic Fox would be like classified as like a body player, right? Like they're very read based and I mean, they're godlike, right? Let's say if I say, take your turn back by pressing a button, right? If you mash out in this sort of interaction, mashing out when I have 50 meter versus 0 meter, that's a lot different, right? And again, that's kind of the problem with this sort of thought process, right? And it's also a problem with teaching, right? It's something that most people don't think about as like someone asking and someone teaching. It's not always equal. Even if the same situation comes up, it's like, do they have burst, right? In the context of something like Gear, right? Gear is a great example, or, you know, most anime games with like bursts, that alone is a big difference. Like if I spend 50 meter to open you up when you have burst, is that as worth it as if I spend 50 meter to open you up when you don't have burst? No. This is why this is kind of a complicated subject, but at the same time it's also kind of hard because it's a lot to explain, right? Like no matter what though, I think at the end of the day, being willing to ask questions is the best sort of trait you can have, right? The best one. There's a very fine line between doing too much and doing too little. And you know, I'd say my content is primarily educational based at this point. You know, I like helping people improve or like think about fighting games differently. You know, and especially if you've watched me play sets, you'd hear me even say that quite a lot because sometimes like just doing even a smidge too little is game losing, right? Sometimes doing a smidge too much is game losing. It's one of those things. In this interaction, I try to do this. If they have meter, I'd consider it differently. If they don't have meter, I consider it differently. If they have burst, I'd consider it differently. Even if you are a feels-based player, then at the end of the day, you can autopilot to a degree. When it comes to things like this, a lot of people just don't think that thoroughly about things, right? A lot of even top players don't do a lot of good things that they should, right? Like a good example is yesterday I was talking about fuzzy blocking, right? Like fuzzy inputs, executing fuzzies in general, and I even said in Exerd, I was like, basically there's a limit to how successful you could be in Exerd without implementing these sort of things, like on a competitive scale. Hotashi replied in the chat, yeah, that limit is me. I never fuzzy. Right? So like, I feel like there's definitely a pedestal for top players. You look at top players and you think like, oh, they're always doing something good, right? It's not always the case. Not everyone will always use the best options. And I feel like this sort of expectation that top players are infallible and geniuses are kind of, it's a little bad, because they're not always perfect, right? No matter what. Even when I discuss these things, there are things I could be doing better. I could be optimizing way better. That's just a product of learning, and that's why it's a journey. But again, like, the problem with teaching is like, if you have to go into like, if you want to do this here, then you have to consider my burst, you have to consider my meter, how much meter do you have? That takes a long time, right? And not a lot of people want to be that thorough, right? Sometimes when I stream and I'm playing, just to be concise while I'm playing, I'll abbreviate the sort of things that are good or bad, right? But again, like, it's not wrong, it's not entirely right either, but it's something to think about and also consider for learning, right?